Happy Monday, everyone. Sometimes it's a little hard to remember that we're in lockdown. It's so beautiful out right now. I feel like my dog is dying to go outside and play. So if you hear her groaning or whining sometime in the middle of this video, you'll know why I'm trying to move us along. I've also got a long run planned for today. I'm trying to avoid my feelings of stir craziness by exercise, right? Whatever method we can to sort of make life feel a little bit more normal. I'm also a little regretful because I know that if we were still on campus, this week would be the last week of our game, and it would be the last chance many of you had to try to pull off your objectives. And there really is no better time than the final week, of course, because the final week is the week on the topic of empire. Athens has risen, it has fallen. We've suffered through the plague and the destruction by the Spartans, but now that we're sort of in the 390s BCE, we have a moment to pause and ask ourselves if we as Athenians would have wanted to try to rebuild the great empire, the Delian League that we once had. And you guys in our game sessions would have been fighting over whether to go, where to go, how much to invest in that mission. And so transitioning from what used to be a role-playing game class now to a more traditional lecture class, I'm trying to organize this week around the question of empire. Should we revisit the Delian League? What might the roadmap for rebuilding it have looked like in the 390s or 380s BCE? And what might have been some of the reasons, either political or ethical, that some people in Athens would have resisted the possibility of rebuilding the Delian League? So today's lecture is the first step in that thought experiment. And the topic, as you see from our title slide, is the Delian League Revisited. I stole this great little image from the second movie of 300. I think it's 300 Rise of an Empire, which is all about Themistocles and building up the Athenian navy to fight the Persians. That, ironically, is going to have a good role in my lecture today, thinking about how the Delian League first got started and what steps we would have to take in order to recreate it. I feel like this lecture you can either do before or after the reading. It's pretty introductory. That said, we'll be ripping a lot of screenshots from the Thorley reading for today. So if you want to open that or have it available, you can pause me, cross-check with what the textbook says, all the better. I like using sources and encourage you to do the same. Okay, feeling ready to start? Let's begin. Okay. If we were still role-playing in our game session, as I said at the top, we as a class would be about to have a big fight, a big last blowout with each other about the idea of empire. For all intents and purposes, Athens had, by the time of our game, lost almost all of its control over the Delian League. There were still a few very small islands in the not far from Attica that were paying small amounts of tribute. But the Spartans, especially Lysander, I mixed them up. Lysander had systematically gone through and eliminated Athens' connections in the Black Sea and in Ionia, such that the tribute that Athens had relied on economically to come from our partners in the Delian League had now been cut off. And if we were still in our game session, those who were the last to go to give their final speech papers would be arguing in one of two veins. And if this were the last game session, you guys would be aligning yourselves as Democrats versus everybody else. The Democrats versus the oligarchs and Socratics would have been trying to present two different visions for how to rebuild our city-state. I think it's fair to say that both sides of this debate did want to see Athens recover and rebuild, but they had very different visions of what that recovery looked like. If you belong to an oligarchic or Socratic faction, you would have almost certainly been arguing that what Athens needed to do was focus on domestic restoration. And what I mean by that is be inward looking, a sort of Athens first policy, focusing on rebuilding our own infrastructure, our temples, shoring up old buildings, spending money on things like our own defensive walls in the way that Lithocles in my first section managed to pull off. The landowners, especially the oligarchic class of landowners, would have wanted to see Athens investing in its farmland. At the height of Periclean Athens, the Athenians were getting a lot of their foodstuffs from outside sources, from Black Sea allies, from Ionian allies, shipping them in. But after the Spartan starvation lottery, I think an event like that really illustrated to many Athenians how heavily reliant they had become on other parts of the world. And so moving back to a self-reliance, being able to produce your own food, is something the oligarchs would have advocated for. As for my Socratics, I don't think it's surprising what they would be emphasizing. Socratics aren't particularly interested in wealth or empire, and they would have suggested that rather than go to other places and conquer other people, we needed to be doing more work looking inward. The Democrats, on the other hand, would be arguing precisely the opposite, and we even got a few suggestions of hints of what they might have said in our last game session when we were fighting about money. Remember, money is tight at this time. We left Athens with an operating budget of about 100 talents with a 30 talent surplus. And if the Democrats had been effective in their debate, they might have argued, kind of like the Themistocles did, that the only way to really boost our economy would be to go out and try to recapture our alliances that we had before the Peloponnesian War. So they certainly would have suggested that we needed to go regain all those areas in the red on the top map there, right? The former Delian League members. That we needed to rebuild our ships and gain our navy. And then, and only then, could we make Athens the financial epicenter that it once was under Perikles, right? You can already hear those arguments coming forward that sure, we can peddle around with farms and infrastructure, but we're never going to see the big scale transformation of our city unless we are willing to go out and conquer those territories that once fueled our growth in the first place. Now, as there's two ways to kind of approach those two veins, and I've decided to go to investigate the democratic part first. What I mean by that is that towards the end of this week, I am going to get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of what might be the ethical concerns, what might be some of the things to give Athenians pause about recreating their Delian League. But for the purpose of today, I'm going to just make the assumption that maybe rebuilding empire is a good idea. Maybe it's something it's worth pursuing for us. And so today's lecture is going to be all about what did it take the former founders of the Delian League and the leading generals of the Delian League, what steps did they take that could help our class have fulfilled a democratic vision of Athenian restoration? So often in this class, I'm sure you've noticed, I don't tend to teach you guys history in a linear fashion, right? I tend to say, here's the topic we're going to investigate today. Let's look at how the people before our game sessions in 403 BCE influenced that idea. And I'm going to do precisely the same thing today for you. And as we go back into the past to look at the previous formation of the Delian League, the big argument that I want to make today is that yes, building an empire did place Athens in a position of unprecedented military and economic power. No doubt about it. If we were still in our game sessions, the Democrats would be screaming at you that the only way forward is the past, to go get what we have lost. But what I think the oligarchs and the Socratics would have brought up is that in order to achieve the dream of the Delian League again, it's going to require Athens to sideline its most prominent, most powerful aristocratic families, as they always seem to do. And it's also going to demand of Athenians the use of tyrannical tactics that have gotten us in trouble in the past. Don't forget, the Peloponnesian Wars started in some part because disgruntled allies of the Delian League came to Sparta and said, Athens is acting no better than the Persians, right? We just got rid of a Persian king, but now we have the Athenians throwing their weight around. But many of the sort of founding fathers of the Delian League, as we're going to see today, also had to use sort of tyrannical tactics in order to keep the Delian League cohesive and to keep its subordinate members in mind. So there's the trade-off, right? All the power, all the wealth Athens could ever need, but sidelining allies, noblemen in favor of that cause. So that's the vein today, and I promise we'll dig more on Friday, especially into what might be some of the philosophical objections to empire. How are we going to go about this? What's going to be our organizing principle for this argument today? Well, I've centered today's lecture around three figures, all of whom should be familiar to you, although some may be more than others. We're going to start with Themistocles, who actually lived long before the formation of the Delian League, but without whom the Delian League would not have been possible. Then we're going to turn to Kimon, the very first Athenian leader of the Delian League. I know we've talked a fair bit about him, his friendship with the Spartans, but there's a few details I've left out. And then we're going to close with the very, very familiar figure of Perikles, and particularly a reminder more than new information about how Perikles strategizes to make the Delian League benefit Athenians specifically. Not this class, but next class, I want you to know I am going to come back to the second reading you had to do for today, which was the funeral oration of Perikles. Now, this is a speech, I'm not going to talk really about it today, but we will on Wednesday. This is a speech that Perikles very famously delivers in 431 to the family members and widows and mothers of dead soldiers, and in it he outlines really why the great Athenian imperial cause is worth it, and how he defines Athens' leadership in the Greek world in the middle of the 5th century. So for those of you who maybe want to write a speech to say, yes, Athens should rebuild its empire, this is exactly where you would be drawing your ideology from. It really is a celebration of Athenian values and leadership, while not entirely failing to acknowledge that Athens has sometimes had to take uncompromising steps to achieve those things. But for today, as you can see their little silhouettes here, Themistocles, Kimon, and then ending with Perikles as our pivotal figure for Wednesday. Let's start with Themistocles. I love Themistocles. My professors in college, one especially at Middlebury College, was obsessed with Themistocles, and she made me obsessed with Themistocles too. All right, we've talked about Themistocles just briefly, but he is undoubtedly one of the savviest minds in Athenian populist politics towards the end of the 6th century, beginning of the 5th century. I talked about Themistocles very, very briefly in conjunction with the Persian Wars and the Battle of Salamis. But today I want to take a deeper dive into who he is, his context, and what were the career-making moments that brought Themistocles to power. Themistocles, we believe, was born around 524 BCE, which you may not immediately associate with some of the historical things we've studied, so I've taken the time to give you some contextual bubbles here. So Themistocles would have been born about 3 years after the death of the tyrant Pisistratus. Remember, Athens began as a monarchy, then it had the Areopagus Council, and then that was eventually overthrown by the tyrant Pisistratus. He would have been about 10 years old during the assassination of Pisistratus's sons, specifically Hipparchus and then eventually Hippias's removal from Athens. So I can imagine Themistocles' childhood being very sort of fraught or feeling like a very politically unstable time. Just wondering who, maybe even a mafia-like feeling childhood, like anybody could be killed on the streets. But Cleisthenes would have also been a teenager, 14 years old. Themistocles would have been 14 years old when Cleisthenes, the great democratic reformer, sorted everybody into those 10 tribes based on their geography. He would have been one of the first Athenians to live in a new democratic system of Athens in which government positions were mostly chosen by lottery. And he would have been 25 years old at the very, very beginning gleams of the Persian War, when Athens is one of only 2 city-states to agree to send ships to Ionia to help them resist the Persians. And as you remember, that very first Ionian War, the Athenians got their ass kicked. So I imagine as a 25-year-old, this would have clued Themistocles into just how dangerous an adversary Persia could really be. So again, you have to think of Themistocles raised in a time of political upheaval, born into a time of tyrants, but as a teenager experienced this great democratic revolution, and in his 20s saw Athens answer the call to resist Persia for the very, very first time. Okay, did that help paint a little bit of a picture of who Themistocles was and how he grew? Great. Now, the thing about Themistocles is, because of the time of his birth, he really had a unique opportunity for political engagement that his father and grandfather would have never had available to them. Themistocles was born into a working class family, right? He wasn't from a distinguished bloodline. He's not one of the Alcmaeonids. He's not like Perikles or Kimon. And in just about any time period prior to this, Themistocles probably would have been a Thete, a really low-class Athenian, only able to maybe vote in the assemblies, but never to run for office. But because of Cleisthenes' reforms, all of a sudden someone like Themistocles now had an opportunity to have his name put in the hat and be chosen by sortition for a government office. And at the age of 30, right around 493 BCE, and again for context, that's about 3 years before Daddy Darius the Persian will invade at the Battle of Marathon, we know that Themistocles ran for office as the eponymous archon, and he won his election, thereby vaulting him to the very top tiers of elected office in ancient Athens. Themistocles, we know, was successful in his bid for office because he appealed to lower class Athenians like himself. He even moved into a pretty poor working class neighborhood called the Kerameikos and became a renowned figure among the Athenians as someone who looked out for the little guy and was always thinking ahead for opportunities to advance the cause of the working man in ancient Athens, and not the elite bloodlines that had been at the top of the power pyramid of Athens centuries prior. So it is like you have a mind like Themistocles, born at just the right moment, kabam. It's like an explosive opportunity for him. Now, Themistocles served as archon and held a number of other government positions, but his real career-making moment arrived in the year 483 BCE. And the year 483 is right smack between the Persian wars of Daddy Darius and then later the invasion of his son Xerxes. During this time, 483, the Athenians struck, I know the phrase is to strike gold, but in this case they struck silver. They discovered quite a hoard of silver at the mines of Larium, which is the southernmost territory of Attica right on the coastline. You can actually go see the archaeological site to this day and see some of the mining pits that were dug. And it was such a massive hoard of silver that pretty much all Athenians knew that this amount of money could dramatically help the city in some capacity or another. And so this windfall becomes a source of debate among Athens' leaders. Wow, we have all this unexpected money. How should we spend it? From what we can tell, there were a variety of suggestions, but the two that got the most acclaim was one posed by Themistocles, one of his ideas, versus an idea from an Athenian nobleman. Now, the Athenian nobleman was a man called Aristides, which in itself means like the best or best leader. And Aristides proposed that this silver should be divided evenly among the Athenians. Now, I don't know what Aristides really said, but I kind of imagine him saying something like, "This is a blessing from the gods. We will share this collective wealth of Athens with everybody evenly. Everybody gets an equal slice of the pie." Kind of takes you back to that Plato lecture I gave on Friday. But Aristides, it's funny, you might be scratching your head and saying, wait a minute, isn't he like an oligarch? Why would he want to hand out money to everyday people? Remember, we're in the new democracy of Cleisthenes, and now the noble members of Athens realize that they can't just be powerful because they're used to being powerful. They also have to appeal to the people. So I'm not certain, but I suspect that one of the reasons Aristides might have liked this idea to divvy up the money equally is he thought that it would make him popular with the lower class people of Athens, who would then elect him to a government position, right? So even though on the outside that idea might look like it was made for populist politics, Themistocles actually had a different idea, and he was the true populist politician. And Themistocles said, "Hold up, Aristides, we should use this money to build boats." And why was Themistocles interested in boats? Well, he knew, of course, that Darius had just invaded Greece at the Battle of Marathon 7 years ago, and he probably had a little bit of intel that Darius' son Xerxes was planning to invade with an even bigger force. And so Themistocles is thinking way, way ahead, kind of like President Cobain does. What's the 5-year, the 10-year plan? And Themistocles thought that if Athens was economically stable, this money might be a good investment in their their military might. Now, another reason why Themistocles might have been so interested in boats as opposed to other investments is that boats are famously associated with democracy. In the midst of this debate, we believe Aristides said something to the effect of, let me zoom in. Nonsense. What do we need boats for? The elite families of Athens have always provided hoplites and cavalry to defend our city-state. Just think of Marathon. Why do we need a bunch of expensive boats? And Aristides technically would have been right. Thus far in Athenian history, most warfare was fought by the upper classes, men who could afford their own horses and their own hoplite armor, the armor with the big hoplite shield. And it had worked. Clearly at the Battle of Marathon, it worked very well. But Themistocles was not satisfied with the Athenian military being built around just rich people who could afford horses and armor. And so I imagine him saying something like, "Okay, sure, I'll give you credit for Marathon, but I don't think that a couple of hoplites and some horses is going to cut it with Xerxes. We need to rely on everybody. We need everybody to participate in the military, not just the rich people with their horses and their armor." So even though it seems like Aristides' idea would be more popular with the people in the short term, right? Give everybody a handout. Themistocles is not just thinking about the handout, he's also thinking about restructuring military service in ancient Athens in such a way that gives the little guy more of a chance to serve and not just the rich VIP members of Athens. For whatever reason, the Athenians agreed that Themistocles had the better idea. And in our reading last night, this whole success story of Themistocles came through loud and clear. It was Themistocles', I'm reading the passage here, insistence on the development of a strong Athenian fleet with the income from the rich, seams discovered in the Laurian silver mines, that really put the demos into a position of power. Remember, demos means the people. And then I'm going to jump down here. He wanted Athens to have a bigger fleet, and it was a strong incentive for the assembly to vote. Using the silver from the mines of Laurium, the Athenians managed to build 200 triremes, which is a massive navy, especially when you consider that a single trireme will run you somewhere around a talent's worth of wealth. But the investment really came worth it, of course, because we know that the navy was instrumental in the Persian War against Xerxes, the Battle of Salamis, and then the formation of the Delian League. Having a really big navy was critical to Athens being able to assert itself as a potential hegemon, a leader on par with Sparta. Without it, they were just a big city with a storied past, but not the military fighting force needed to resist Persian influence. And in so doing, in convincing the Athenians to build these boats and eventually to evacuate Athens and then fight the Persians in them, what Themistocles really recognized was that there was an overlap between a healthy, strong navy and a healthy, strong democracy. That when you have thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of Athenian men rowing, everybody feels more at stake in their city. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why many modern nations have required mandatory military service like Israel. It's in part because when you fight, or at least learn how to fight on behalf of your nation, it gives you a greater sense of ownership in that nation, right? You have put your life on the line. And so Themistocles doesn't see democracy and the navy is disconnected, right? There's a clear overlap between the two. And that's also something our reading pointed to last night, that when used correctly, the navy can be a way to dislodge powerful elite families from being the only ones who get to call the shots about the military, right? As this passage says, others from the wealthier end of the spectrum doubtless saw that the consequence of putting so much of the state's available resources into the fleet would be that those who manned the fleet, which are almost all poor people, would see themselves as the main armed forces of the state, which they certainly became. So, for those of you who want to write a paper about the power of the people, about restoring Athenian democracy, about balance and equality, rebuilding our navy isn't just a good decision militarily, it's also a good decision democratically speaking. Okay, to wrap up the Themistocles story, I think there's two lessons I want you to take away about what Themistocles' example teaches us. The first, if you are going to build up an empire, it is going to cost you some serious cash, or at least a big investment of cash. So you have to figure out where it's going to come from, and you also have to make the case why it's worth it to spend money on things like boats and rowers rather than things like temples and farms. On the flip side, it might be easier to convince people of that because in a direct democracy like Athens, more votes matter than who votes. So if you can get the poor and working class Democrats on board, i.e. the very people who want to get paid to row warships, then you have a much better chance of success, right? Your elite families may not like it, but it doesn't matter. You can just outvote them by the sheer persuasiveness that everyone will have a job under this new Athenian navy. Okay, spend some money, make the people happy. Way to go. I feel like we all know Perikles is going to take a feather right out of Themistocles' cap. All right, our next person we're now going to move to is a person of a different cut entirely, and of course, that is Kimon. Now, it's been a little while since we talked about Kimon, but just to refresh your memory a little bit, Kimon, of course, is the son of Miltiades, who was the leader of the Battle of Marathon. He comes from a very distinguished bloodline. He was a bit of a party animal as a young man, but he got his stuff together somewhere between his 20s and 30s, like I hope we all do someday, and managed to position himself to be the first Athenian general of the Delian League. And this, again, to refresh you, when the league against Persia first began, a Spartan regent, Pausanias, was put in charge. But because Pausanias was accused of Medizing and was not a very liked commander, that gave the Athenians a vacuum, an opportunity to put their own person in charge, and that was Kimon. One of the reasons, again, rewind your brain back to, I think, like week 4, one of the reasons Kimon was such a desirable figure is because of his close friendship with the Spartans, at least at the beginning of his imperial power, right? And the Thorley reading reminded us of that again. Kimon pursued a policy of friendship with Sparta. In 462, Sparta appealed to Athens for help in suppressing the Helot revolt, and Kimon was the one who tried and ultimately failed to spearhead a campaign to help the Spartans. And things didn't go well, which again eventually led to his ostracism by Ephialtes and Perikles. Now, I want to switch gears though, because all of that information, the idea of Kimon being a very effective aristocratic leader, a good military general, the victor at the Battle of Eurymedon, a friend of the Spartans, that's all old news. What I want to look at with Kimon is very narrowly two decisions Kimon makes, or two policies that he carries out under his leadership of the Delian League that show us the first inkling of Athens beginning to throw its weight around as the leader of the Delian League. Now, just to refresh your memory, I don't know if I think I forgot a map here. Remember, when the Delian League was first formed, people could join it under two different categories of being an ally. You could either contribute ships to the defensive force, like if you were the island of Lesbos, which was a very naval, maritime heavy island. If the lesbians had their own navy and they could just say, okay, anytime there's a military engagement, we'll contribute ships. But many of the smaller city-states who did not have large navies or didn't have the expertise to build them agreed that instead of contributing ships, would contribute a cash payment. Now, originally, this seems like a good idea, right? Militaries are expensive. And so for the Delian League to operate, there has to be a steady stream of income coming in to pay for boats, boat repairs, generals, food, the whole sheboygan. But as time went on, fewer and fewer cities particularly liked the idea of paying tribute or taxes to the Delian League, which seemed curious they liked paying tribute or taxes to the Athenians more specifically. And in our Thorley reading, they actually called it an extortion racket, kind of like protection money, the kind of mobster move like, boy, it's a nice pizza shop you got here. It'd be a shame if it burned down, right? Like that kind of racket. That's what the Athenians are running. I personally think that might be slightly overblown, but it's not too far from the truth. Okay, back to Kimon. When Kimon was in charge of the Delian League, and his leadership lasted for over a decade, from 478 to 463, we saw the first two attempts by Delian League members to revolt, to try to pull out of the Delian League. And this was just a very short little chunk of the reading, but I think it's significant. The island of Naxos in 469-8 and the island of Thasos both tried to withdraw from the Delian League. These were cities that had been contributing ships and no longer wanted to do so. In the year 469 specifically, we know that Naxos made an announcement to Athens, something along the lines of this: hey Athens, it's been like 10 years since the Persian War ended, and we don't really think Persia is much of a threat anymore. So we'd like to check out of the Delian League. It's been nice fighting with you. We're going to take our ships and go home. See ya. Now, clearly the people of Naxos had a vision in mind of the Delian League as a club you could just join or leave whenever you felt like it. It reminds me a little bit about how I feel about my Netflix subscription. Some months when I'm being really productive, I'm like, no, I'm not going to watch TV or veg out, so I cancel it. And then some months, like now, when I'm super stressed out, I'm just like, Netflix, so be it. We all need what we need. But the Delian League was not like Netflix. You cannot just resubscribe and unsubscribe whenever you feel like it. You are in it for the long haul. And indeed, when Naxos tried to withdraw from the Delian League, the Athenians, led by Kimon, said, yeah, no. Nice try, Naxos. The Delian League is something you agreed to. It's all for one and one for all, and you can't depart. Now, I want you to take a look for a minute at the size of Naxos by comparison to the size of Attica. Naxos is a small island, right? They're a member of the Cyclades Islands. And it's not a particularly powerful place. Naxos is, of course, the island that King Darius burned and enslaved as he was making his way across the Aegean Sea towards Athens. But Naxos is just big enough to be significant in the Delian League and just small enough for Athens to bully. And bully they did. Under Kimon's leadership, the Athenians blockaded the island of Naxos for months, and it cut them off from any food imports or any other sorts of goods that Naxos relied on from the outside world. Island economies are all about trade and fishermen and imports and exports. And for months, the Athenians held them in kind of the way the Spartans would do to Athens later, and forced the people of Naxos, just through starvation and poverty, to surrender and to come back to the Delian League. This strategy was also applied a few years later in a territory further to the north, near the opening of the Black Sea, on another island called Thasos. Thasos, kind of like Naxos, it's a little bit bigger than Naxos. You can see it right there. And again, Thasos was not a threat to Athens, but it was just big enough and just small enough for the Athenians to make an example of. So again, under Kimon's leadership, the assembly votes to surround Thasos and force it to surrender to participating in the Delian League, even though it desperately didn't want to. We don't get a ton of information about how Athenians felt, about how other Delian League members felt on this. We get a little bit of a whiff of the sentiment surrounding these mini rebellions from Thucydides. And in this passage, I want to read a little bit to you of Thucydides kind of agrees that the Athenians are being bullies, but he also sort of blames the allies for being weak in and of themselves. He says of all the reasons why city-states revolted from the Delian League, the main one had to do with late payments of tribute and ships. The Athenians were super harsh and exacting, meaning the Athenians wanted you to contribute on time. And when other allies didn't participate, the Athenians applied the screws to men who were not used to doing continuous work. So in this half of the passage, it seems to me like Thucydides is kind of acknowledging, yeah, the Athenians were the bad guys. If you didn't pay on time, they came to your house and they broke your kneecaps. I'm really clearly in a mafia state of mind right now. I should go watch Goodfellas or something. But a little bit further down, he says, he kind of seems to blame the allies. For this, the allies had themselves to blame. The wish to get off service, making most of them arrange to pay their share of expense in money instead of ships. Thus, while Athens was increasing her navy with funds which they contributed, a revolt always found the allies without resources or experience for war. The point Thucydides is making here is that in the early phase of the Delian League, the rest of the Greek world was perfectly happy to kind of sit back and let Athens do all the work. Like Athens had the biggest navy, they had the leadership, they were the ones who wanted to go fight with Persia. So everybody else said, yeah, okay, I'll just write you a check. You go do my work for me. But a decade, 2 decades later, when those same allies now wanted out of the Delian League, they were totally unprepared in comparison to Athens, which had been getting better and better and better at naval warfare over the years. You see what he's saying here? Like, if you let somebody else be the leader, then you can't complain when you don't like the way that they lead. All right, so again, like I did for Themistocles, my big 2 takeaway lessons for Kimon as a roadmap for how to build empire. The first lesson, stay on good terms with city-states who are powerful enough to challenge you. You need to know how big you are and how much you can really, how much to bite off that you can actually chew. Kimon stayed friends with Sparta, maybe because of his personal connections, but also probably because he knew that Athens, as it was growing, could not afford to go to war with Sparta. But on the flip side, Kimon was ruthless about keeping subordinates in line, and he knew that it was much better to have to be a bully to a small island like Naxos or Thasos and scare the bejesus out of everybody else than if all the big guys revolted as one, right? You really have to beat up on the little guy in order to show the bigger guys not to mess with you. So that is the Athenian tactic under Kimon in order to increase and maintain the power of Athens' empire through the Delian League. Okay, we've got Themistocles, we've got Kimon. We're now going to close on Perikles, who should be really familiar to you all. When we think about the Delian League leadership of Perikles, we've talked a lot about the fact that in some ways Perikles was not nearly so gifted a general as Kimon, that he almost immediately alienated the Spartans. But what I actually think makes Kimon a brilliant strategist in his own right with the Delian League is his understanding of economics and how to manipulate Delian League contributions in such a way that benefits the Athenians. So if we're going to put Pericles on the roadmap of how to build an empire, this is the big takeaway strategy he employs. Use the Delian League to maximize wealth. Take every opportunity available to you to build money, to build market through the Delian League. But on the flip side, and this is why I have this little siphon, You also need to minimize the number of people who are going to benefit from this wealth, right? You want as much wealth in the hands of a minimal beneficiary group. That way, the select people that you want to benefit really feel the benefits. All of the things mentioned in the Thorley reading should by now be pretty familiar to you because we've learned a lot about Pericles' policies, but I want to hit up the three main categories that I think Pericles employed this strategy brilliantly when maneuvering empire to work for him and to work for the Athenians. Strategy number one here, really make a killing off of trade. By the time of Pericles, Athens had extended its network of trade hubs and imports and exports all the way to the Black Sea, to Ionia, even into Egypt. And this benefits Athens domestically because Pericles applies essentially a 2% tax on all imports and exports. And Athens becomes a major trade hub for medics, for foreigners, for foreign royalty. It becomes the place where everyone lands to hawk their wares. And in this passage, it also points to the fact that at the very same time as he's applying high taxes to trade goods, he's also restricting citizenship so that the people who get the payouts from those taxes dwindles, right? Remember the second week of our game where we had that big fight about citizenship and medics? It's about how many people get a paycheck from the Athenian government in exchange for their control of the Delian League. The second area where Pericles brilliantly organizes empire to work for Athens is in his clerices. This may take a little bit of jogging in your memory. A clerice is any territory where the Athenians sort of claim for themselves in their empire, and then they allow poor Athenian citizens to go get some free farming land and set up a life there. It's kind of like 40 acres and a mule, like you get a free plot of land and a setup. But the cultural benefit for Athens is that Athens is sending out its citizens all over the world to promote Athenian values and to promote Athenian loyalty. Like if I'm living on another island, but I'm from Athens and I have Athenian citizenship, that I'm going to be a natural advocate for all things Athenian. In this passage from the Thorley reading, just take a look at the places where Pericles is happily sending people. He's sending them to Naxos, right? The island where we just had an attempted rebellion. Pardon me. He's sending them to Thrace, to the Chersonese. These are territories close to the Black Sea where trade is essential. He's sending them to South Italy. Again, the boot of Italy is critical for trade and control of the Mediterranean. And at the bottom of this passage, we learn that upwards of 4,000 citizens are leaving Athens and becoming expats throughout the world. We see this time and time again with world empires. The British colonizing parts of the African continent, sending people to build lives for themselves in India, in Taiwan. You see this to some extent. You definitely see this with the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, right? Colonizing America. America never really becomes an empire per se, but I do think it's significant that such a big chunk of the American population lives elsewhere in the world while keeping their citizenship as advocates for the American nation state elsewhere in the world. And as a benefit, there's a bunch of poor people who get to leave Athens and make a new financial life for themselves elsewhere. So it's a two-way street of benefits. The last area of benefit that I want to talk about in relation to Pericles is, again, perhaps the most familiar to you. The fact that Pericles uses Delian League money to build up the Acropolis and doesn't apologize for it. After the Persian War, the Persians had left the Acropolis in a state of destruction. But over a period of about 25 years, Pericles uses Delian League money to restore it to the grandest Acropolis and cultural center that anyone in the ancient world had seen, maybe with the exception of some of the Babylon temples or the pyramids of Egypt, right, which could rival them. And in this passage, which I plucked out, we get one little hint that not everyone in Athens agreed with this idea. Thucydides, not the same Thucydides the historian, but a different Thucydides, was a leader of the aristocratic opposition to Pericles. He was related to Kimon, so we have that old rivalry. But the line Thucydides took in opposing Pericles' building policy was a moral one. He said that it was an unjust use of the money contributed by the allies for defense against Persia. Pericles argued that the allies were paying for defense and they were getting it. What Athens did with the money it received was entirely up to Athens. So Pericles is essentially saying, look, maybe I have $1,000 from the Delian League, but maybe it only cost me $100 to defend against Persia. So what I do with the other 900, that's up to Athens. That's up to me, and I will use it however I want. Now, I personally think that Thucydides here makes a pretty good argument. It's not fair to use the extra money for things that the members of the Delian League don't agree to. But the people of Athens clearly agreed with Pericles. In 443, Pericles proposed that the issue should be tested by ostracism, and Thucydides was ostracized, right? This just goes to show you how powerful Pericles' influence with the people really was. He says, look at this rich guy, this relative of Kimon. He's trying to tell us what we should do with our money that we earned fair and square through our leadership of the Delian League. Get him out of here. And it works. Pericles snaps his fingers and the populace votes to expel Thucydides from Athens. Again, not the same as the historian Thucydides, different Thucydides in this passage. So just like the last two, what are the lessons we can learn from Pericles? Well, one, if you want to build an empire, it behooves you to be really clear up front how you're going to use the money. What are the profits? Who's going to benefit? And second, and this almost goes without saying, but you want the people who are going to profit to be the very same people who have the ability to put you in power again and again and again, right? That's exactly what Pericles does so well. He harnesses the power of the people and benefits them for voting his way. So to wrap up in sum, my big takeaway lesson for you is, just like the Roman Empire, the Athenian Empire was not built in a day. It was built over a period of decades by at least 3 leaders who had the foresight to recognize how empire could be achieved through naval might, and then in turn how they could use that naval might to promulgate the aspirations of Athenians specifically and not the Mediterranean world writ large. But each one of these people also understood to a degree that the levers of power in a place like Athens come down to the people, the demos in the democracy. And so if you are going to advocate the rebuilding of an empire, you have to do it by emphasizing the deep overlap between naval might and Delian League might and the people of Athens themselves, one and the same. Next class, just to get you prepared a little bit for Wednesday, we are going to return to the Thucydides reading. We're going to look at the funeral oration of Pericles and see how, towards the end of his life and at the very outset of the Peloponnesian War in 431, Pericles justifies to his fellow Athenians why Athens deserves and has truly proven itself to be the school of all of Greece. All right. Boy, that's an inspiring note to end on. I'm ready to go vote for Pericles right now. Okay, I'll see you guys Wednesday.